Welcome to the Oceanicity podcast. This podcast is for anybody who cares for and is doing something to help improve the health and balance within the ocean and all living things in it. And for those of us that just enjoy going into the ocean, rejuvenating, interacting, and just being curious about all the living creatures in there. There's so much unknown, and it's such a great place to try to explore and learn here on our planet. Welcome to Oceanicity, everybody. I'm your host, Rick Peterson, and today's curiosity is going to focus around mangrove forests. So some of you may find it a bit odd that I'm talking about mangroves in regards to ocean conservation. Let me give you a quick overview to what made me feel like this is such an important topic and is 100% part of ocean conservation. Mangrove forests are an integrated part to so many coastal ecosystems within the ocean. I discovered this firsthand while on my experience in Bimini, where the mangrove forests are a foundational part of their ecosystem as a lemon shark nursery, and also home to many other marine species. And in that experience, along with some additional self-discovery I've done, it seems to be showing me a reoccurring pattern. This pattern is the intricacies of how our society's regional decision makers' drive for economical growth can be unbalanced with the ecological preservation and protection needed for sustaining our oceans and planet's health. So we are really gambling with our planet's ecology and creating what I like to call ecological debt. So many regional mangrove forests around the world have been very negatively impacted by this ecological debt of our decisions related to the urbanization and other exploitations related to economical growth. That said, there are many groups out there actively involved to make a positive difference with both proactive and reactive actions. So I decided it would be great to find and talk to someone who is actively involved in working to help improve this. So I'm delighted that we have Dominic Wodehouse, Executive Director and Community-Based Ecological Mangrove Restoration Trainer from the Mangrove Action Project as our guest today. A little bit about the organization and Dominic. MAP is a US-based nonprofit which collaborates with stakeholders at all levels to preserve, conserve, and restore our world's mangrove forests. And now a little bit about Dominic. From 2006, he was a mangrove technical officer for Wetlands International and at the same time volunteered with MAP assisting field projects within Thailand. Between 2011 and 2019, he's been teaching the community-based ecological mangrove restoration for MAP in Thailand, Cambodia, Tanzania, Colombia, Honduras, and many other locations. On completion of his doctorate in 2019, he moved into the executive director role within MAP. He is also a member of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, Mangrove Specialist Group. Welcome to the show, Dominic.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let's just dive right in. So give us a little bit of an overview of what the Mangrove Action Project does and what its mission is.
So we're a small nonprofit based in Seattle. We're scattered around the world. We have two products, if you will, that we focus on. The first is mangrove restoration training. We run workshops for various groups that need capacity building. And the second is a schools curriculum for largely late primary school kids. It's often, or sometimes it's a little bit older. And that teaches the kids the benefits, the values of their local mangroves, how they work, the biology and ecology, and why they should be conserving them, why they should be looking after them. And then beyond that, we do a lot of other sort of pro bono work. We run a photography competition every year. We run an art competition for kids, which is then put into a calendar. But we get contacted by a lot of journalists like yourself, researchers, students looking for help, looking for site advice. So we help from that point of view. As you say, I'm a part of the IUCN's Mangrove Specialist Group, so we interact with a lot of these big international groups that are dealing with mangroves, trying to push the mangroves up the policy agenda. I spend a lot of time helping small NGOs, local NGOs, with their mangrove restoration projects. So they would send me GPS points, ground level photos, and we might talk on Zoom, or I might send them an email about suggestions that they might try to improve what they do.
Wow, that's many things that you're trying to cover there. So then that really leads me to start wondering about, so what are some of the challenges and complexities the project is dealing with on a regular basis?
From the restoration point of view, the challenge is almost always social. We know the science. There's a nice paper, a research paper in 2000 by Ellison, which with the title of which is "Mangrove Restoration: Do We Know Enough?" And in 2000, he's concluding correctly that we do. The challenge is always social, and the solutions are social. We have to work with local people and build their capacity so they value what's around them, and they improve the restoration that they do. That's one challenge. The second challenge that I'm very conscious of, having just finished a PhD, is that there is a real lack of appropriate communication of all the great science that's there to the mangrove restoration groups that actually work on the ground. The academic world, and I'm guilty of this too, produce research papers because that's what a university wants or demands. Local people, government, mangrove agency, field officers, they don't read research papers. They're unbelievably dull. And the English is agony, and they might well be behind a paywall. So there's this cutoff of communication. And actually, one of the things that really inspired me to get into mangroves in the first place was the late, great Robin Lewis, who used to be our technical director, saying to me at a training, what's really needed is the informed supervision in the middle. Someone who's read all the science, but can actually sit in the mud with the local people and draw stuff in the sand and work with communities and give that knowledge so as that they can make their own decisions about when to restore, how to restore, where to do it.
Yeah. So really what you're doing is you're trying to build that sustainable, evolving sort of restoration effort and things like that. And you're really
That's
focusing
it.
at a local
That's it.
level and community based level,
Yeah.
which is great.
It has to be. It has to be local because these people need to look after the mangroves once you've left, nurture them, try and keep other people out, stop them being destroyed, stop them being eaten by animals, um, and and they need to benefit from it. It can't be some pristine sort of museum that no one can go into. It has to be usable, but used sustainably. So the only people who can do that are the local people. Similarly, just from a logistic point of view, there's a huge amount of coastline and only, say, two or three of us trainers, and no government agency has enough resources. So it has to
Yeah.
be local
Oh,
people that manage
which is
this.
a really great approach. And I also sort of saw, like when I was reading on it, just how, again, when you jump in there, you're sort of, you also don't just do that sort of, here's the three mangroves that grow really, really fast, really, really well. You do that localization of what are the species or in that area so that you keep it, you're
Always.
growing that thing,
That's it.
which is just
That's it.
phenomenal.
So both the schools teaching and the restoration training, we both try and adapt those programs to the local situations. So there will be a different lineup of species, but also there'll be different challenges and different conditions. So we had a fascinating time in Senegal in the Saloum Delta, and in this delta, it's incredibly salty. Bizarrely, it's a reverse salinity delta. So the further inland you go, the saltier and saltier it gets. And so that needs special consideration, techniques, different change of species. Other places, it was much more of a social problem. In the Rufiji Delta in Tanzania, it was much more to do with local people encroaching what was a very freshwater system in order to produce rice. In some other places that we were working, particularly Thailand, it's a lot of recovery from aquaculture ponds. Again, that's very technical. It takes quite a different approach. You really need to understand what you're looking at. So we always adapt depending on where we are.
Okay, that's great. So if you could what would be one story, like a success story, that you could share with the listeners on when you've gone into a place and you see that it's actually going in the right direction? I'm not going to say it's done because nothing is ever really done, right? So, so
My teaching colleague Jim Enright, who's based in Thailand, gave a training and a seminar in El Salvador in about 2011, I think, and then helped a group around, and I'm going to pronounce this really badly, Jalisco Bay. Anyone who's Spanish speaking, please don't bite me. And they had a big area of mangroves that was dying off, and it was either tectonic uplift or I think a small earthquake that filled in a lot of the hydrology with all the sort of surrounding sediment filled in the hydrology. And this area had died off. And so surveying with Jim, they realized that it was basically a lack of hydrology. And often from a biophysical point of view, that's the problem. So these people unbelievably dug about 10 kilometers of canal and
Wow.
it's quite wide. It's about 2 or 3 meters across, and it's a couple of meters deep. And this is probably clay, and I've done a bit of it, and that's really heavy. To reconnect this area with the outside hydrology, and then just let it rip on its own. And there are enough mangroves producing seeds and propagules all around. So as the natural regeneration is facilitated due to this improved hydrology, and then it's just coming back on its own. Really pleased to see that. One of the nice things you can do is you can see it from Google Earth, so you don't actually have to go and go there. We can see it just filling in and filling in, which is really encouraging. Um, and the local people appreciate that there are a lot of benefits to them for improved mangrove health and connectivity, as well as sort of more trees. So they can extract wood and honey and so on, but also it really improves the local fisheries,
Hmm.
because many of the crab and fish and shrimp species use the nurseries as a nursery,
Yeah.
if they're accessible. And so that habitat, which protects the small fish, the small crabs, and the small shrimp, and also the export of organic carbon, is the basis of the inshore food web. So healthier mangroves means much more productive inshore fisheries, which is obviously great for their livelihoods, great for their food security.
No.
So that was a really nice story to see.
Oh, that's amazing. That's great. So where would so now almost the exact opposite. Where was a time where you were somewhere where it just seems to just not work very well? Seems to be taking a little bit longer. And what do you think some of the next steps may be in that region?
Um, During my PhD research, I was having a look at Thailand and the Philippines. The Philippines has done a lot of planting in and around a program called the National Greening Program. The desire is absolutely right. They had a terrible cyclone called Haiyan or Yolanda, which flattened a city called Tacloban. Lots of people died, really horrible.
No.
And so they have expanded this national greening program to include mangroves as well as reforesting hill slopes to avoid landslides. The challenge is that, unfortunately, a lot of the teams are not reading the science, and this is what I mean about the lack of communication between all the sciences out there and what happens on the ground. And so, as writers like Dr. Primavera have documented, and I've also found in my research, that they are choosing the wrong site. They're working on mudflats, which are too low down relative to sea level. And they're using the wrong species, red mangrove, which is a mid-zone mangrove, way below low zone mangrove area, and not ecologically where it should be applied. And seeing repeated failure, as in 100% mortality.
My goodness.
And so there's all sorts of negatives from that. It's a waste of money. As a Philippine taxpayer, that obviously upsets me. But also, these people need these mangroves. These people need healthy mangroves to be protected behind them for all the benefits that they produce. So that's frustrating because the science isn't getting through. And it's the villagers will think, well, we're not going to bother to support this because it doesn't work. They're not having their capacity built by either the government or local NGOs, so they don't really understand why it's not working. And unfortunately, they're being paid in sort of piece rate. So in a sense, they don't care if it works or not, as long as they get paid. And they'll plant it again and again, and it will fail again and again. And we haven't managed to engage them in this process because we're just using them, or they are just being used like labor.
Okay.
So there's all sorts of things that really could be done better, and I really hope that will improve soon.
Okay.
And that's not just the Philippines; that happens all around the world.
Yeah.
I'm afraid.
Yeah, because I find that I mean, I'm not in in the business years, but when I'm working with other organizations, and then what I sort of do, again, it's that everybody's looking for this really simple, standardized process that everybody can follow,
Mm-hmm.
and there is no such thing.
Mm-hmm.
Things are way too complex, and we got to really localize,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yep.
which is really important.
Unfortunately, so.
So, what is a personal thing that kind of drives you? Because again, like I can only see, like I've talked to other people at nonprofits, like I always really am inspired by you because again, you're waking up. There's these challenges, and you keep going and you keep going. So, what is it that's kind of inspiring you and keeps you driving this initiative?
Well, it's not the money, that's for
Yeah.
sure. Um, I think it's lots of different things. I suppose ultimately there's a danger that we could actually help. We could actually sort of improve stuff on the ground. and we're not going to get a hit every time. But the thought that some stuff could be done better on the ground, that mangroves can come back after our training is always really sort of motivating. It was really motivating during our last training in Tanzania. We had the Tanzania Forest Service field officers in this training room, and it was interesting, motivating, great to see two of them looking at each other, and you can see the penny dropping, you can see the light bulb coming on, and they're both going, that's why it didn't work. I get it. We've changed their behavior. Now they're not going to do that. They know what they're going to do, and that was just priceless.
Yeah.
It's interesting because it's a complicated challenge.
Yeah.
There's a social dimension. There's a biophysical dimension. There is a policy dimension, and all sorts of other things. It's interesting to get on site because there are lots of different gradients, if you will: salinity, wave energy, pollution, soil, radiation, harvesting pressure. So, in a sense, you need to use your powers of observation to look at nature and see what nature is telling you and be able to read that. And the older and the grayer and the bolder and the fatter you get, sort of better you get at it, because you've just seen more and more and more sites. So you can interpret what you're seeing of why isn't this stuff growing, or why isn't it working?
Yeah.
And then I really like the mangrove community. We have our own biannual shindig called MMM as a conference circuit. Mangroves, Macrobenthos, and Management, I think the conference circuit is called. Super nice people, really nice people. There's a lot of hugging going on when we see each other, and they're all passionate, driven, really interesting people. And the Mangrove Action Project gang are super. Yeah. I really like having a chat with them. We have a team catch up every week. Really nice people.
Well, that's awesome. That's great.
So it has to be said, my mother has said to me on more than one occasion, "When are you going to get a real job, dear?"
I got one.
Followed by,
I'm trying to say
mangoes. Why are you working on mangoes? I haven't quite got that idea through to it yet, but I know I'm working on it.
That's amazing. Now, another one which I kind of see as one of the potential threats, that again with the climate change and rising sea levels and things like that, how are you incorporating that in this model, or what are the things that we can try to do to be preventive? Which or how do we react to that a little bit more? Is there anything that?
Sure. So from the climate change, as far as I understand, the data doesn't necessarily support that there are more big weather events, but the data does support the fact that they are more violent.
Yeah.
And the winds are stronger, as far as I can remember from various reports that I read. Partly because there's only really sort of good data since the 1950s or so.
Yep.
So we're looking at violent weather. Sea level rise is a site-specific function. Some areas are sinking fast, some areas are actually rising.
Okay.
And so, again, it needs local adaptation. So from our point of view, mangroves are line themselves up, and they all like to live very specifically relative to sea level. So if sea level's rising, they all want to migrate up, back, and sort of inland. So in an ideal world, we try and make sure that there is space behind them and up for them to migrate up. The challenge is that there's quite often infrastructure, roads, seawalls behind them. So they're just going to get sort of concertinaed, if you will, and the space that they have available gets compressed. So that's one issue. Second, we just try and make sure they're as healthy and as resilient as possible. Good hydrology, you can see if the tree is stressed by all the normal terrestrial tree features. If the crown is dying back at the top, you can see that it's stressed. It's got a sort of full head of hair, if you will. It's obviously sort of doing better. Third, we want to try and make sure that we've got all the species that should be locally present in a country actually on site, because as conditions change, and bear in mind, it's complicated because there might be changes in rainfall patterns, so the salinity might change. There could be changes in when this rain appears, and so that will also affect the soil bacteria, the mycorrhizal association. It gets quite hairy quite quickly. So we want to make sure that all the species are there, because we might find that some species that we like don't survive this climate change and how that affects the soil and the rain and so on and so on. We've also seen species-specific die-offs in various places. I'm thinking particularly Tanzania, where the red mangrove, the one you have in the US with the iconic prop roots and drop roots, that was the only species that was dying off in an otherwise healthy mangrove. So if you only planted that species, and then this, we think it's a bacteria, it's being researched at the moment, this bacteria turns up, you're left with nothing. So we really need to make sure that we've got all the species and relatively even representation of each.
Okay.
It's not sort of one plant of that, one plant of this, and then everything else is red mangrove. It needs to be, if you've got 3 species, 30%, 30%, 30%. Some of them perform differently depending on big weather. So the tolerance to having a lot of mud dumped on them during one storm is different by species. Similarly, some of them can coppice and some of them can't. So what I mean by that is that if a huge wind hits these trees and the stems, trunks snap, some species can recover. They sprout from below where the snap is and they just come back. Other species, if you snap them in the middle of the trunk, that's it, game over.
Wow.
So if all your mangrove is just that species, then you get left with nothing. Yep. So there's all sorts of things we can sort of try and think about. More technically, we can try and make sure that the hydrology and the channels go actually sort of further back inland to encourage the mangrove, to help the mangrove grow back further inland and up. And then particularly protect the front mangrove. So there'll be different species depending if you're at the front, sort of lower part, as opposed to the middle, as opposed to the back. The front is always the most difficult to repair because it's often facing the wave energy. So if they're going to use the mangrove sustainably and take out wood, which is fine, local people to repair houses, build houses, and so on, don't touch the front because that's so difficult to fix. Okay. It's really difficult to fix. And actually fringe mangrove for the same idea, just 5 meters, 10 meters of mangrove rather than a real delta, is much harder to restore. So those are the sorts of things that we try and teach, depending on the situation.
Okay, great. Well,
so sorry, that was a bit more.
No, that was awesome. That was great information. Let me tell you, I'm finding out more things, and as I said, I'm so interested in this as well.
I'm going to test you at the end of this.
Are you?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll do a second episode, and then you can quiz me. How's that? All right. What is one thing that you personally would like to see more of to help this cause?
Easy. We get approached by different groups, but also organizations, all obsessed by blue carbon. The idea of blue carbon is that mangroves store a huge amount of carbon within their ecosystems. Up to 90% of it can be in the soil. It's not the trees, it's the soil. Carbon builds up in the soil because of layers of sediment forming on top of themselves with leaves and small bits of organic matter, and that sort of builds up over time. The fine roots grow out into the mangrove and then die, and they're replaced, and those die, and they're replaced, and those die, and that builds up organic material. The mangroves leak humic acids and some other bits and pieces into the soil and carbohydrates, so that also builds up the carbon. So the soil underneath a mangrove can be meters of literally solid carbon, just peat, and so they're very valuable as carbon stores and also sequestration, and they continue to sequestrate carbon into the soil sort of year after year, rather than just having a set amount which they churn. So a lot of people are interested in this because it's close to the water. It's called blue carbon. Loads of people get in contact with us trying to then buy carbon credits for these the carbon stored in this mangrove. And it's frustrating because they're just fixated on this one particular ecosystem service that mangroves provide. Mm-hmm. But for us, they provide so many more benefits to local people in particular, that we would really like people to get away from the idea of blue carbon projects and think much more holistically about the mangroves and how they allow local people to live a much more sort of positive, sustainable life. Because the mangroves also provide material that you can build your house with, material that you can cook your rice on. There's a palm called nipper palm which lives in the mangroves. You can turn the leaves into roofing, and food security, protection from big waves, storm surges, etc., etc. Just think Bangladesh, or think Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar. What happens if you don't have it? And all sorts of other sort of non-timber forest products. Sorry, terrible phrase, like honey and so on out of the mangroves. Livelihoods of weaving some very fibrous leaves from things like phoenix. et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many more benefits than just blue carbon. We see too many groups getting fixated just on this blue carbon issue, and it's a shame. I think we're sort of missing the point. From our point of view, blue carbon projects are very difficult to manage, if only because it means you've got to guarantee that land remains mangrove for the next 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
And if it's somewhere politically fluid, shall we say, then a change of policy can mean that the game is up.
Yep.
Similarly, there is a political risk because for whatever reason, a government like, say, Madagascar has recently announced that NGOs such as us now do not have the right to run these projects and sell the carbon credits on behalf of the local community. The only group that can sell carbon credits out of that nation is the Madagascar government.
Okay.
I mean, okay, I'm not talking about that as a sort of value judgment, but that means that then the control is very much out of our hands.
Yeah.
And obviously the government's going to want a big slice out of that, and that makes the economics difficult.
Okay.
Beyond that, the price of carbon is very low. And I think there's an expectation that the whole project can be run by carbon financing, and it can't. There's no way near the maths work. And the projects themselves only make sense if you've got some huge area of mangrove, 20,000 hectares, 30,000 hectares, and trying to control an area that big is in many countries absolutely impossible. So I wish groups, funders, companies, and so on will move away from blue carbon to actually see what I think the IUCN, Dorothy Hearn, the IUCN refer to as blue natural capital.
Okay.
So the idea of mangroves as a really useful ecosystem that do all sorts of things, not just store carbon.
Yeah.
So that's my hobby. That's one of my hobby horses.
Okay.
To get on and beat.
Okay, that's great. Thanks. So the last one is, okay, let's try to see if we can action some of the people that are listening. How can the people that are listening help map out or even help out the conservation of mangroves?
Nice question. So for conservation of mangroves, be aware of how valuable they are. Try to, if you live near them, try and support efforts to stop them being built on or destroyed for urban planning, urban expansion. It's quite possible to put roads through them. Just make sure that hydrology is not cut off. So if you're a civil engineer building roads, please give us culverts or tubes underneath your road at the appropriate points and the appropriate height to make sure that the mangroves are not cut off. Do a bit of ecotourism. If you find yourself in Thailand or whatever, go paddle through some mangroves and spend some money with the local community who have probably changed from cutting the mangroves down and turning them all into charcoal into ecotourism hosts, doing kayak tours, whatever. Go see them. They're really interesting, beautiful ecosystems. And just be aware of how valuable they are. They don't take up much space in the sense of 3% of the land of the global landmass, if I remember correctly. But they're a super valuable ecosystem doing something really, really useful. From that point of view, our biggest challenge is core funding. We don't run projects on the ground. We don't have offices on the ground. We've got great groups like WWF and Wetlands International and TNC to run offices on the ground. What I need is a very few highly skilled, highly motivated, very qualified trainers to train these local people to build their capacity, go around the world and run these workshops so as groups on the ground know what to do. Mm-hmm. And making the maths work within MAP is difficult because trying to pay these people a living wage is really difficult. The teaching that we do doesn't pay, it doesn't cover it.
Yeah.
So we'll be delighted if anyone wants to go to Mangrove Action Project's website and donate. That would always really help.
Okay. I'll make sure I put the link also in the podcast for that, for sure.
If you can, that would
Absolutely.
be lovely. That would be super kind. But look after the mangroves around you.
Okay.
If they're there, see them as super valuable. It's not just mosquitoes and stinky mud. They are really valuable ecosystems that do an awful lot of very good things. Please look after them.
Thank you very much, Dominic. I really appreciate your time giving us an overview of MAP and your experiences. It was very insightful and given me many more things to start thinking about and probably do a little bit deeper dives on. I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me, Rick.
So I'd like to thank Dominic from the Mangrove Action Project for your time and great stories and information. There are links in this episode for those who would like to support and learn more about them. So my reflections and insights from this discussion. Ignorance is a short-term bliss. A common success pattern is working locally and starts with each of us at a personal level, changing and challenging our beliefs, focus, and behaviors. We need more people to be the adapters to integrate into the local communities and put the science, data, and facts into the context of their communities and help the evolution of building better understanding in all of us, as this is a critical part to managing the ecological debt. To the listeners, thank you for your time and support, and if you like these discussions, please subscribe and enjoy Oceanicity. And until next time, enjoy the ocean.